Organizational development expert Dr. Jessica Kriegel is the author of Unfairly Labeled. She joins us in partnership with the American Leadership Forum to talk about how workplaces can benefit from focusing less on generational stereotypes. Next on Studio Sacramento.
At Five Star Bank, we create thoughtful solutions to help the Capital Region thrive, from economic development and education to public health and safety, issues that are vitally important to Sacramento's prosperity. We're proud to be part of the conversation and hope you'll join in.
If I were to ask you guys, like, what do you know about millennials? Well, they care about feedback. They care about being empowered. They're entitled. I hear that a lot. They're super entitled. They're tech savvy. Maybe they're lazy, right? These are all the commonly associated stereotypes with the millennial generation. Let's say I had a flip chart up here and I was writing millennials, what we know about them, and I wrote all those things down. Now imagine if I erased the word millennials and I replaced it with some other identifier, like black people, or women, or something else, right? It would be obvious how inappropriate it is. It is incredibly inappropriate for us to say, well, black people are entitled and they're tech savvy and they're lazy and they need feedback. And it's obvious because we've had so many conversations societally about race and gender and stereotyping. But it's still culturally acceptable to define people based on the generation that they fall within, and so we do it comfortably. And that's a major problem.
Dr. Kriegel, it's interesting how we as a society think it's okay, based on the clip that we just saw, to make all kinds of stereotypical assumptions about millennials that we would never make about other groups or communities of people in this country. Tell us though, what are the distinctions and differences between generations that you found in your work and research?
I actually didn't find any differences between the generations. There are trends,
really?
Things that change, certainly, but there's nothing that I can point to because the generations are so large. There's 80 million millennials. Some of those millennials are illegal immigrants in the Midwest, and some of them are CEOs in Silicon Valley. So to say that we can label them as one thing, there is some distinction, is really just, it's oversimplifying the complexity of human behavior. So there isn't a difference. And the stereotyping doesn't just happen with millennials. It happens with baby boomers, right? Baby boomers are apparently very hardworking. They are loyal to their employers. They are maybe conservative. No, not all of you are. So it happens to every generation. Millennials is probably the most commonly stereotyped generation just because it's the newest right now. Generation Z, which is the generation younger than millennials, will be next, and there are already hundreds of articles and books written about them too.
You know, it's interesting. In your book, Unfairly Labeled, there's a passage you have in here that I want to read to you because it makes me wonder as to whether or not this is the same conversation that's been going on forever. So this is, it says, children no longer rose from their seats when an elder entered the room. They contradicted their parents, chattered before company, gobbled up the dainties at the table, committed various offenses against Hellenic tastes, such as crossing their legs. The counts of the indictment are luxury, bad manners, contempt for authority, disrespect to elders, and a love for chatter in place of exercise. And this is
Socrates.
Yes.
2,000 years ago.
Yes. And so it almost sounds like the popular culture, which talks about the differences between baby boomers and millennials, is sort of like this natural historic thing where it is that people of of an older generation like mine would say to a younger generation like yours, your music is bad, your clothes are weird, and you don't pay attention or give us the proper respect.
The complaints have not changed in 2,000 years. Imagine, I mean, they talked about chatter as opposed to just hanging out and talking to folks. Chatter sounds like an app to me that older people would complain about young people using, not having respect for the elders. I mean, that's the exact same complaint that we're hearing these days. So nothing has changed, and it's not generational. I think it's a life stage issue. I mean, one of the distinctions that is so rarely ever made in any of the research on generational differences is, what are we seeing that's actually a life stage difference? Because when you're young, you have certain priorities, and as you get older, maybe now you have a family, and so now you have priorities around family, whereas when you were 18 years old, you didn't have a family, and so you didn't prioritize that. I mean, it changes as you age. It's not about the generation. It's not about the year in which you were born.
But where does this come from? Because I have to tell you, as a retired CEO, I and my management team used to have this conversation all the time about what are we going to do to get smarter on how to attract and retain and motivate millennials, because they're like these foreign, from another planet,
Right.
invaders who've come to frustrate us.
Yeah. It's because things are changing so quickly now with technology, with the internet. There is so much volatility, there's chaos. Technology has accelerated the pace of everything. And so change management is even outdated now. We don't even talk about change management anymore. We talk about agility and how can we change every moment, be ready to pivot at any given time. And so if we can blame it on the millennials, if we can blame it on the youngest people who seem to have come with the technology, and we can understand them somehow, then maybe we can crack the code. But ultimately...
But this is in the press all the time. Where does all of these statements and kind of pronouncements come from?
So the generational label of millennial was invented by these authors named Neil Howe and William Strauss, and they wrote a very popular book, many popular books, but the one that was probably most popular, they wrote in 1990, in which they outlined all the different generations and then laid out their stereotypes for every generation. It resonated with people, and then research started getting done in the scientific community and the academic community. So now there are hundreds of thousands of theses that are written about generational differences and studies that are done. And these studies are done with small populations of people, or if they're with larger populations of people, they're still being done in kind of lazy academic ways.
What do you mean?
Research.
What do you mean?
So I will give you an example. There's an author named Jean Twenge, and also she co-authored the study that I'm referring to with Stacy Campbell. And they looked at 1.8 million people over the course of 80 years, from the 1920s all the way to the year 2000. And they were looking at people who were in their early 20s that had filled out some kind of psychological survey that they were able to later gather and then compare. So what they were trying to do was isolate for age difference. So everyone that they were looking at was in a different generation, but they were in their early 20s at the time that they took the survey. And so they came up with these 5 different distinctions of differences between each generation. One being, for example, that every generation is getting more anxious and more depressed. And when you look at their population size, that it's 1.8 million people, it seems very legitimate, and the research seems solid. And Jean Twenge has a very successful career right now as a consultant and academic and speaker on generational differences. The thing is, there wasn't any evidence that they accounted for differences in the medical community diagnosing anxiety and depression. So if you picture walking into a doctor's office in 1920 and saying, I'm feeling kind of blue and don't want to go to work, what should I do? They'd kick you out of there and say, just get to work. Whereas now they'd say, what kind of Prozac do you want? I mean, it's a very different approach to mental illness now than it was 80 years ago. They also use tools. For example, one of their conclusions was each generation has less need for social approval than the last. And they use that to then make a conclusion about that's why younger generations don't dress appropriately in the workplace, that they wear flip-flops to work.
Why does the press latch on to these things?
Because people read it. Because it's sensationalistic headlines about interpersonal dynamics that maybe folks have experienced before. Everyone has had an anecdotal experience of having some kind of miscommunication or discord with someone in another generation. We turn that one instance into a generalization about the entire group of people of that age range, and it's popular.
But not accurate.
But not accurate. I mean, it can be accurate. There are certainly millennials that are lazy and tech savvy and spoiled and entitled and all of the things that millennials are
just like baby
supposedly.
boomers.
Yeah, just like there are baby boomers that have strong work ethic, but there are also millennials that are not like that, and baby boomers that are not like that. There's so much diversity. And what makes up your personality and the way that you want to be managed is not the 20-year wide arbitrary age bracket that you happen to have been born within, but rather a system of thousands of factors. I mean, it's genetic as well as how your family raised you and whether you had books in your home and whether you went to college or not. And all of these things make up the person that is the employee in your company or applying for your company. And so assuming that they're going to be one way because you read it online somewhere is really not seeing the person in front of you, which is lazy leadership.
Right. Now, while you're known for your work in terms of your authorship on millennials and trying to decode, not really decode, but kind of explode the myths related
the myths, yeah.
with that issue. Most of your work and research today is in helping corporations deal with issues surrounding being more productive and working together better. If you were to recast the whole conversation on millennials in a way that was more reflective of what you encounter in the workplace, how would you label that? What's the problem that we're all trying to fix?
The solution is something that looks very similar to situational leadership, which people are familiar with. It's a very common model of leadership in which leaders, you know, the golden rule was treat people the way they want to be, the way you want to be treated, is now we've determined that that's not actually the best way to be a leader, but rather the platinum rule, which is treat people the way that they want to be treated. And so the powerful leader is one that understands what makes this employee tick versus that employee, how this employee wants feedback versus that one, and then adjusts their style based on the person that they're talking to. That's what we're looking for, is rather than casting this net of what millennials are like and then treating all millennials the same, i.e. giving them lots of feedback, allowing them to volunteer, because that's what millennials want, and whatever other stereotypes.
And a free coffee bar.
And a free coffee bar and a nap room and whatever other things that millennials supposedly want. It's understanding the millennial in front of you. And maybe they do want a nap room and a free coffee bar, but maybe they want something completely different. And if we don't do the work to get to know the person, have that sense of empathy and communication and understanding, then we're really just cutting ourselves short.
I want to come back to something you said a few minutes ago that was really interesting to me, which is what we might label as a generational difference is more accurately portrayed as a life stage difference. Mm-hmm. Do we as society account for life stage differences in terms of how we interact as employers, as community members, as even family, in the ways that ultimately would create greater harmony?
I think it's a very tricky issue in the workplace to discuss because there are so many ways in which we can use life stage as a discriminatory element.
Oh, really?
Well, yeah. I mean, think about when people get closer to retirement age, then I've worked with a number of organizations who, when they have to have massive layoffs, they end up pulling from the oldest people in the group because they're going to be closer to retirement anyway, and they're not, in theory, as cutting edge or
and
as
we're
fast.
higher paid.
Well, that's also true depending on the role. And so that can be kind of tricky to think about that, is what life stage are they at, and then what assumptions are we then making about what they want? Because that's also an assumption. It's assuming what someone wants because of the age that they are.
Isn't it also, though, an opportunity, for instance, if you're trying to create greater productivity and greater retention, if you understand that some of your employees are in a life stage where they may have small children, or conversely, they may be caring for aged parents, that particular accommodations taken into consideration, those life stages, might be a more appropriate way to get more out of that employee and create a greater happiness and success.
Yeah, absolutely, as long as the solution is individualized. And it's not the theory that any woman that comes back from maternity leave is now going to want to work from home, for example, or whatever other assumption we can make about someone because of the life stage that they're in. The problem that we have is we confuse life stage differences with generations so often. So a very common stereotype about millennials is that they're not loyal to their employer. And so the Employee Benefits Research Institute actually measures tenure based on age within different organizations, and they found that people aged 25 to 35, their average tenure was 3 years long. People aged 55 to 65, their average tenure was 10 years long. So when people read that, they think, oh, see, there's evidence that millennials are less loyal and that older generations are more loyal to their employers. But the Employee Benefits Research Institute that does that study has been doing that study for 40 years. And 40 years ago, the numbers were exactly the same. So it's not that millennials are less loyal, it's that people who are new to their career are going into some job, trying it, realizing, you know what, I thought I wanted to do sales, but actually I want to be a dancer. And then they're leaving and they're going to try something else. People later in their career, maybe they've tried enough things to now know this is what they want to do. Maybe they're closer to retirement. They're trying to get access to some golden handcuffs that they're going to get when they leave. So there's many different reasons why that might be, but assuming that it's because of generation or even because of life stage can be dangerous.
Well, let me try an example out for you and get your reaction to it. One of the common things that's talked about in society that is attributed to how it is that communities should position themselves in order to attract and retain quote unquote younger people, millennials, within their communities is they point to a writer named Richard Florida who wrote a book called Rise of the Creative Class. And his thesis was that younger generations, particularly millennials, migrate to locations not the way that previous generations did, which was based on employment, but based on lifestyle. And once they get to a place that fits their lifestyle, then they find employment in order to support that lifestyle, which is considered to be different. What would you say to that author if you were sitting here, if he was sitting here right now, about his thesis?
I would ask for evidence, first of all, to understand if that's actually playing out in reality. I mean, where I see all of the millennials moving these days are where there is substantive organizations that are hiring, so there's that. B, it depends on the millennial, right? So to say that the millennials are all one way is, again, to just blanket label 80 million people as being the same, which I just can't get behind. So maybe there's a trend in this direction, and maybe that has absolutely nothing to do with generation, but more has to do with now there's a lot more remote opportunities to work from home. And so because young people have more opportunity to work from home jobs, then there's more of a tendency to do that now than there was in the past.
Tied to a geographic location.
Yeah, is that a millennial thing, or is that an industry thing? Is that an economic thing, a technology thing?
You just spoke about trends. What other trends, just from the perspective of a researcher who studies the workplace, what other trends are you seeing in terms of the types of challenges that are going on in the workplace today?
There are a lot of challenges around how different people communicate or prefer to communicate, and how that leads to increased or decreased collaboration in the workplace. So now there are many more options for how we can communicate, whereas 40 years ago there weren't. So we can use tools, instant message tools, we can use email, we can use text message, we can use phone calls, we can use in-person, we can use WebEx, we can use video conference. I mean, there's so many different options. And so I know organizations are struggling with navigating how do we best get the message to the group that we're trying to communicate with, and how do we best facilitate collaboration across different departments so there's more lateral integration in the way that people are working together.
You've actually done some work also in the area dealing with sort of even the physicality of how people are located together. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's a field called workplace strategy, and it is essentially looking at how the physical space that you operate in facilitates an organization getting their objectives, or having a productive organization of employees, or even creating the culture that they're trying to get. I mean, culture it can feel like a very touchy-feely, kind of fuzzy concept, and is difficult to talk about, but it can be broken down to very simple brass tacks. Like culture is outcomes that are created by behavior, which is either enabled by the system or blocked by the system. And so it's this three-part formula that I use with my clients to explain, okay, what are the outcomes you're trying to get? What is it that ultimately you want to achieve? And these can be numbers-based. It can be a revenue number. It can be the impact that your nonprofit is making. It's just very brass tacks. What is the outcome that you want? Well, in order to get that outcome, your employees are going to have to behave a certain way. So if your outcome that you're looking for is, agility as an organization, then behavior, what does agility look like? Very simply, it looks like people being able to get approvals done quickly, and it looks like people having maybe more risk-taking. So just very identifying what those behaviors are. And then ultimately, once we identify how we need people to behave, we can look at the system and how that is either enabling employees to behave that way or blocking them from doing it. And then culture change is ultimately about how do we change the system to get people to behave differently so that your outcomes are different.
And is physical space a part of culture as well?
Absolutely. The physical space is part of those systemic enablers and blockers.
Like, give us an example of how a physical space either impedes or propels better communication and outcome.
So cubicles versus offices, open workspace, open collaborative workspace versus private offices. I don't have an opinion about which one is better or worse because it ultimately depends on what you're trying to achieve. There is a stereotype that millennials want open collaborative workspace.
Yeah.
And so if we do that, they'll somehow be happier. Ultimately, it depends on a lot of different factors, whether you like that or not. But what the research shows is that when you have open collaborative workspace, the level of conversation that is had in the office is more shallow, because there's more people that can overhear you. So you're not going to have intense personal conversations with people, which means it's harder to build trust because you're keeping conversation at that kind of shallow level. And so you're actually creating an environment in an open collaborative workspace that is less prone to having those deep levels of trust amongst employees, which might create a culture of more bonds, which means perhaps more risk-taking. I mean, there's a lot of different consequences to that. On the other hand, if you have private offices, people can come into your office, you can close the door, you can have those intimate conversations, which can be a good thing, but then it also silos folks in another way. So ultimately, what you have to ask yourself is not what do millennials want or what's necessarily, I mean, you want to think about the economics of the differences between private offices and open collaborative workspaces, but really, how do you want people to work together and which space is going to facilitate that?
It sounds like you're saying there's no one size fits all.
No, I mean, people always ask me, so what's the best kind of culture? It completely depends on what you're trying to achieve. I mean, there's not a better, I know the kind of culture that I would want to work in, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the best kind. It's just a personal preference. It goes back to not making assumptions about there being one way for everyone.
When you think, though, about, we're in 2018 right now, and if I were to watch one of my favorite shows, Mad Men, you know, The Office of the 1950s and 60s was far different than the one of today. Project out about 20 years and tell us, how will, with technology and all the other changes taking place in society, how will our communication, collaboration, and workplaces be different in the future than they are today?
I think we are struggling right now with the transition from in-person work to remote work. And so there are teams that are entirely remote that function very well, because when everyone is remote, everyone is kept in the loop virtually. And then there are teams that work in person that work very well, because when everyone's there, you can talk together. Where I see the most struggle with my clients is those that have some people working from home and others in an office. And it's a struggle for the people in the office to include the people who are working from home that day, or who are virtual, or who are on another site. And so that is the challenge we're overcoming right now. I think 20 years from now, we will have solved that problem. It'll become second nature to open up a video conference when you're in the office, to walk into someone's office and have a little side conversation, but then pull someone in virtually to be included in that conversation. Because very often right now, people who are virtual end up feeling left out of many of the conversations that happen organically in the workplace. And I think our technological tools will improve to the point where that will no longer be a problem. And that'll help a lot also with the real estate issues that we have, that right now, a lot of companies are spending a lot on real estate. I mean, it is a very expensive line item. And so we could remove that if we are more functional at including people virtually.
Let's talk about the soft side of those office environments. When you look at management, what are typically in the organizations you go into the places where most managers are lacking training or experience to make them effective?
I think it's the self-awareness piece. It's the concept of, what am I doing to contribute to this culture, and how might my blind spots be affecting the group at large that I'm not realizing? That self-awareness piece is really the thing that most managers struggle with, because ultimately we all have blind spots, and we can't see them because they're blind spots by definition. We can't see them, and we need people to tell us about those things and to support us with that. The problem is, in an organizational setting, everyone that reports into you, you control whether or not they get to keep their job. I mean, you ultimately decide if they get a raise or not. There's political issues at work that make it difficult for them to tell you the honest truth, unless you have a confidant, but then that also becomes a problem for them with the rest of the group. I mean, there's a lot of politics involved.
And we'll leave it there. Dr. Kriegel, thank you so much. And that's our show. Thanks to our guests and thanks to you for watching Studio Sacramento. I'm Scott Syphax. See you next time right here on KVIE.
At Five Star Bank, we create thoughtful solutions to help the Capital Region thrive, from economic development and education to public health and safety, issues that are vitally important to Sacramento's prosperity. We're proud to be part of the conversation and hope you'll join in.
All episodes of Studio Sacramento, along with other KVIE programs, are available to watch online at kvie.org/video.